How about that?
Do you
Can
want
you?
to try changing the slide?
Oh, now it won't change either. How very strange. How about that? Okay, 1 second. Let's get this working properly. Okay. How about that? Can you see them changing?
Yeah.
They were changing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
You. Okay. I don't know why I restarted the app. So just to go back to Shannon, you can see Shannon on the right now. And she's the person making a fire. Because what she's doing is she is welcoming us to her country as non-Indigenous researchers and helping us to reflect that we are on country, even though we're in the city, and also how to foreground Indigenous knowledge that underneath the country, underneath the concrete of the city, there's still Indigenous knowledge. This is a very important ritual in Australia. And what I'm doing now to begin my talk is called an acknowledgement of country. And I do that as a non-Indigenous person. And what Shannon does before an event is a welcome to country, because it's her country. She's able to welcome people and I'm able to acknowledge people as a settler. So I thought I would share that, and I might come back to that, the politics around that a little bit later, because it's very important to research in Australian cities. So also before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this work. And you would have seen that the article is co-authored by Anita Sylvia, who is an amazing researcher and activist in Surabaya, who you may have come across, and Celsia Tiffany, who's a designer who designed the maps that are mentioned in the article and discussed. And then also Michael Ido Imantaka, who did the very important job of translating the work from English to Indonesian language. So all of us have worked together, and even though I'm just presenting today, I want everyone to remember that this kind of work is very collaborative. Okay. This is what I'm going to hopefully discuss today in my 40 minutes, Pak Falak. Let's see how I go, but let me know if I'm going over time. If we have time, I will cover a little bit of the theoretical framing in the article, mentioning Kurt Iverson, Doreen Massey, and Nancy Peluso, who are responsible for the theoretical concepts used. And I'll talk a little bit about methodologies, so how we go about this kind of research. and then what findings came out. So this is all material that is in the article also, but hopefully talking about it, it's presented in a slightly different way. And if we have time, I would like to show you some other examples of counter mapping from where I live, just to show you how these kinds of approaches can be applied in different cities. So I know you've all had a look at this article, and I'm very grateful you've all had a go at reading it. It's not easy as an undergraduate student to read academic articles because they have a particular format and logic, and they're a particular genre. So I'm very grateful that you've read it. This particular article is from a special issue, and sometimes when we read articles in journals, it's good to think about actually where they were published and in what context. So this special issue, which was edited by Ashalam, Michelle Lobo, and Donna Houston, it was about alternative urban imaginaries. And if you have a chance, there's quite a lot of open access articles in this special issues, which all link to the idea of counter cities, and I guess the idea that cities are not necessarily what we take them for granted to be, that underneath cities, if we research and look properly, there's actually all these kind of alternatives. So there's articles in that special issue from Africa and Asia and New Zealand, and it's a really great place to have a look at further research. Cities is an interesting journal because it is interdisciplinary. So there's a lot of urban planning scholars who publish in cities, but there's also a lot of design researchers like me, architects. I'd say that there's a lot of people who work in governance like you, lots of social scientists. So really anybody researching who is contributing to different ideas of the city, understanding cities in different ways, unpacking cities, this is all part of this journal. So it's quite a good place to start if you think of yourself as an interdisciplinary researcher. Is everyone good? Can everyone see my silly drawing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Fuefa. So I just wanted to show you this drawing or this mind map because, as I said, approaching academic articles can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming, and that's okay. So one of the things I want to do today is unpack how it comes about. And it really is just, it's writing down research and thinking, but often that thinking is not in a linear way. So it doesn't come out in a beginning, middle, end kind of way that the article might seem. It comes out in a much more, for me anyway, it comes out in a much more kind of interlinked, messy, organic way. So this is a bit of a mind map of the article itself, that we were linking the idea of cities within the city to the idea of counter mapping, which people hadn't really done that before. We were doing that through the case study of Surabaya. And because we were doing it through the case study of Surabaya, we were looking at literature around DIY urbanism and about bottom-up urbanism. And this is quite specific to Indonesia, do it with others instead of do it yourself. So there's a lot of literature that comes out of scholarship of activism in Indonesia, which looks at how people set agendas, collaborate, and work together to do it with others rather than be told what to do. So that was one of the threads of the articles you probably saw that links into how subcultures operate, how activists work in urban environments. And again, specific to Indonesia, how cities are really made up of neighborhoods or kampung. You know, kampung is a word that doesn't have a lot of meaning for people outside Indonesia, Malaysia, perhaps Singapore, but is a very important way to think about how cities exist within the city spatially. And we looked at kampung because kampung is also a historical concept, as you would know. And so looking back and trying to understand how Surabaya was made into kampungs. They're not just kind of emerging, but they're also top down, and to understand that, how that happened historically. So you can see that there's a lot of different ideas going on at the same time. And I guess I wanted to point out that this can feel like, what do you do next? But really, it's really, there is a system to it. And you get all these exciting ideas and you kind of have this case study and you do all this research, and then you start to organize it from something that might look like this sort of messy drawing into something that might be an article. So how to get there? We're going to start with the theoretical framing of the article and the research. And that is also quite interdisciplinary, and it begins what's in the title with cities within the city, which is a concept in itself. And it comes from Kurt Iverson, who's a human geographer, urban geographer from Sydney University, who wrote an article in 2013, quite a long time ago, about cities within the city, where he really was trying to explain diverse urban practices. So how cities were more than just people driving around, selling things, trading, finding housing, living in housing, going to their jobs. There was really this whole range of diverse urban practices that was happening within cities. That might sound like quite an obvious idea, but the issue is it's not something that's necessarily studied in a rigorous way. So he pointed to cities which had these kind of urban practices which contributed to people being able to live differently in the city, and to be able to form community economies, and to be able to set agendas for things like social justice in the city, like affordable housing, like environmental justice. So values that went beyond just profiteering through urban growth. So this work that he did about a decade ago, it linked to some topics that are pretty hot and current at the moment, and have also been developing over time. And two of those that I wanted to mention, one is pluriversalism. So the idea that there's a pluriverse, that there's not just a universe, that there's a pluriverse all happening at the same time. That's from an anthropologist called Escobar, who, in my field of design research, it's been very significant to understanding that there are multiple histories and therefore multiple futures that are possible. And then the other idea that I wanted to point to is decolonization, which is part of the idea of cities within the city. And I reference here Tristan Schultz, who's one of the Australian First Nation authors on decolonisation. And I wanted to just briefly talk about decolonisation because it will come up a little bit later when I discuss place-based research. But I wanted to use it as an example of how concepts and theoretical concepts and framings have very different meanings in different places. So decolonisation in Indonesia means something quite different to what decolonisation means in Australia. In some ways, it's based on the same idea, but because Indonesia has a very different history to Australia, and then we can't really talk about where we're at in terms of a long process of decolonisation in the same way. So I don't know if people know much about Australia, but Australia is not yet a republic. It is still essentially part of the British Empire. So to talk about decolonisation in Australia is still, from a First Nation perspective, it is still a very much a live, ongoing process. So it's quite different to talking about decolonisation and post-colonialism in Indonesia, where the Dutch colonisers were given the boot, right? So we've already have an independent nation which has got a different relationship to colonisation. So it's just one example to think about Indonesia and Australia having very different histories. To think about, we say decolonisation in research, sometimes like we mean the same thing, but unless we put these ideas in specific places, they really don't mean anything. Does that make sense so far? I hope so. But maybe if there's things that I'm jumping over a little bit too quickly, we can also come back to them with Part Falat later. So Kurt Iverson asked, what kind of space is created within the space of the city? And we liked that question. And so we wanted to ask what kind of maps are created within the map of the existing city. So that's why our work focuses on maps and particularly counter mapping. So the other theoretical framing, which is really important to this article and we can't really go much further unless we're kind of on the same page about this, is the idea of place. And place is one of these words. I was thinking about this, how this would kind of make sense to you as an audience, of undergraduate students, you know, doing social science and governance in Indonesia. And I was trying to think about a translation for this concept, but I don't think I can, or maybe in the discussion you can help me, because what we mean by place conceptually in this article is not place like tempat. It's not place like a point on a map. It's this idea of place as being something quite ongoing, that is becoming, and that's always dynamic and in process. So this idea of place, a lot of geography scholars have kind of played with in their work, but we specifically refer to Doreen Massey, who is a feminist geographer. She passed away a few years ago. She was a British feminist geographer who did beautiful work on understanding the language of place and the idea of how places come to be, and also how people make places, not in the terms of placemaking as a kind of governance concept, but in terms of placemaking as in there is no place without people making it. So what she means by this is that she has two main ways that she talks about this. One is through a concept of thrown togetherness, which is a place is really defined by a lot of stories that are happening so far and different elements, social, historical, material, human, non-human, these all come together to be a place. It's not a point on a map. And the other way that she describes it is the idea of trajectories. And I really like this one because it means that, you know, when you have a timeline, when you're describing a history, and you might have points like the Industrial Revolution, and then modernization, and then colonization, and then different points, and then and it feels like history as a kind of has stopping and starting points. But the idea of trajectories helps us understand that all of those points in histories are actually arrows that intersect in places. They're always ongoing. So it's a different way of representing how place is in relation and can be redirected in different ways. So as an example, this is one of the maps we looked at in the article, and the emphasis on this map is on the old city and its design, and also particular elements of how this place, if you like, is made for and by women, workers, through working, through trade. It is maybe the same place that you have seen on other maps, but the way it's described is in a kind of Doreen Massey kind of way of describing place. So the last concept, just before we get into the how we did this research, the last concept is the concept of counter mapping, which is also very key to this article. And it links to place because, of course, we want to map a place, but if we're mapping a concept, a place through Doreen Massey's concept of place rather than just a longitude and latitude, one way to do that might be through unconventional ways or through counter mapping. So countermapping was actually coined by an American sociologist, but she was doing work in Kalimantan. So this idea came from research in Indonesia. And what she was doing, she was looking at maps of Kalimantan and the forest resource extraction in Kalimantan, but then she was also looking at how people were using countermapping methods to produce different kinds of knowledge about what was going on. So you often have different types of maps which are in contest with each other, so they don't align. And this was one example she used where you might have mapping by the government and by planners and industry that are quite different to the way Indigenous occupants map that area. And so you have kind of data in conflict in a way. Countermapping is something that's been taken up by lots of different fields. A lot of artists and designers have taken the concept, the idea of countermapping and used it in lots of ways. So again, like place, it's kind of got a lot of movement as a concept. And when we use these kind of concepts in our work, we need to be really precise about how we're using them. So this is an example of countermapping that's a little bit more contemporary than the Nancy Peluso one. This is from some of our colleagues in the Philippines, and this is published on a website called This Is Not an Atlas, which is a really great place to go if you're interested in countermapping and you're interested in that as a kind of research method. Collecting data in participatory ways, visualizing that data, using that data and those maps to advocate for particular kind of agendas in the policy arena. Okay, so we'll move from the theoretical concepts now into talking a little bit about the methodologies. So it's all very well and good to want to discuss these interesting concepts, but how would you go about doing that? And so what I'm going to do is talk about methodologies. And I'm sure you've done a little bit on methods and methodologies in your class already, in your degree already. So perhaps this is revision, but let's see. Theoretical framing, what I talked about before, those three concepts, it should always link to how are we going to make use of that? Well, I believe there's, I'm not a philosopher, I'm an applied researcher. So if I talk about theories and philosophies, it's because I want to use them to ask particular questions. So then a methodology is our approach to answering those questions. And a methodology is really just a set of methods. So we have lots of methods in this particular piece of research, and I use lots of different qualitative methods in my research. Those are usually place-based. They're often practice-based because I'm a designer, so I'm often using creative methods. And they're almost always ethnographic because I'm trained in the methods of anthropology, which means that I use ethnographic methods. So that might sound scary, but don't be scared. Stay with me. An example of ethnographic research is walking. Walking is an example of ethnographic research in the city and is really essential to doing work on cities within the city because as we walk, we observe, we find paths that you don't see when you're in a vehicle or other modes of transport. We have our eyes to the ground. We're able to use all our senses. So our eyes, our ears, touch, smell. Imagine when I know Lily said that you did a walking tour last week, I think, and I went on that walking tour as well. And something that was so striking to me and a reminder of how much sensory research we do when we're walking is the way that the smells changed as we did that walk. So I'm not sure what time of day you did the walk, but when we were doing it at the end of the day and going past the fish market into the perfume area, there's so many different smells, which you would only get if you're walking, if you're on the ground. So we would call that sensory ethnography, and people might call it a smellscape of the city. So the other part of our methodology is to remember that we do place-based methodology. So you remember how I was talking about place and Doreen Massey's idea of place? So a place-based methodology for me means starting with that idea of place. So it really means starting with a very complex idea of where we are. So remember how I started this talk with an acknowledgement of country? That's a very place-based thing to do, because while I was talking about the Sydney Basin, I wasn't talking about what might be the first thing you would think of the Sydney Basin, the Sydney Harbour Bridge and, the Sydney Harbour. I was talking about the many histories of Sydney and starting in the place where I'm actually sitting now and what might be intersecting there. So place-based methods and place-based methodology is a way to kind of group together methods that might prioritize that kind of idea of place. Oh, and this is an article that could be useful. It's also open access, so everyone is welcome. If you can't get a hold of it, just let me know. I'm very, very happy to share it. Which is really a methodological article. So different to the other one, this is like, how do I go about using place-based methods to study cities? So it might be useful for projects further down the road. So linked to place-based method, there's lots of place-based methods. And one that we use quite heavily in this article is archival and counter-archival. So using the archives, but using them with the mindset of counter-archives. So in this article, we both read and we make archives. So we're reading the colonial archives. I love another geographer, Tim Cresswell. I love the way he describes using the archives as reading the archives along the grain. So, and then also reading them against the grain. So to just use an example of this colonial map on the left, which is in the article, we know that maps both reveal and conceal things. They always do. There's no such thing as a neutral map. Maps always have a power structure, something that they're prioritizing. So if we read this map from 1925, which we know is a Dutch map, we know what was going on in Surabaya in 1925, and we read it along the grain. So we read what it was made for, why it was made. We can understand that the power structures that shaped Surabaya are literally drawn into this map. But if we read this map against the grain, what we're looking for is quite different. What we're looking for is what is not on this map. Okay, so it's like when you look at a drawing and you see the positive, the marks on the paper, or you see the negative space in a way. And I think that's what Cresswell means when he says, look at the archives, look what's there and approach them with a critical eye, but also look what's missing from them. So this is another archival map that we looked at. I just wanted to include this little story just because it's a research story. We often don't know what we're doing when we do this stuff. So this was mostly Anita who was looking at the archival maps and going into the archives in Leiden. We are so lucky that we have access to digital copies of archives, that we don't have to fly all the way to the Netherlands. We can look at these beautiful maps and understand them. But there's only so much we can understand from the line work. I don't speak Dutch. None of my co-researchers speak Dutch. I don't know if anyone in this room speaks Dutch, but it's very difficult to read Dutch maps if you don't speak Dutch. So I asked someone who I work with, his name is Bert Bongers. He's an interaction designer, so he has nothing to do with the kind of research I do. And I just said to him, would you mind having a look at this map for me? I actually don't really know what the words mean. And so I just included here the email he sent back, because he was so happy to help, not even knowing what the research was about, but really was able to show me that this particular map was about the depths of the channel, which when we read that map with the grain, we understand that the reason that the depths of the channel are important are so that ships can bring resources out of Surabaya to go and be sold, to be traded on the global market. And you can start to understand how important this infrastructure is to the profiteering of the colonial forces. So because I didn't, without Bert's help, understand kind of what was being measured there, it's just an example of how you can kind of start to ask questions and then you need to kind of reach out and get some help. It can be quite fun. So that was talking about going to the archives, seeing what we could find out. We're also contributing to new archives. And this is an example, this map is an example that Anita made through observing, through place-based researching, walking, drawing, and counter-mapping the Canal Kalimas. So there's a lot of detail in this map, and it really contributes to our knowledge about the city. How am I going, Pak Falat, for time? I probably should hurry up.
Yes, 10 minutes left.
But including discussion.
Oh, only presentation.
Okay. All right. I think I'm okay then. I'll
10
keep
minutes.
going. Thank
Okay.
you. So I think this is the last method I wanted to mention that we used in this article. I mean, some of the things with these methods is you might do them already, but you might not think of them as research methods. And lots of qualitative research methods are actually like this. So photo documentation is an important research method for me and for many social scientists and for many design researchers. This is a participatory mode of photo documentation where these photos were published, annotated, shared on Instagram. But there's so much data in these images about how people are seeing the city, how they're traveling through Ganggang, between Kampong, and, you know, this is in its own right, these photographs illustrate the cities within the city. So by starting with the theoretical concepts of countermapping, Doreen Massey's idea of place, and Kurt Iverson's idea of cities within the city, that was the theoretical framing we used. And then we used these many methods, but all of those methods were started with the idea of place. So they started with being in a place and then working out how to research by photo documenting, by walking, by drawing, by looking at the archives, by observing and putting together an understanding of the cities within the city of Surabaya. And what we found out is that Surabaya has many cities within the city, that's clear. That as a method for visualizing counter cities, making maps or counter mapping can help present different versions of a city like Surabaya. Now, why is that important? We didn't really have time to go into this, space to go into this in this article, but I would really love to do more on this. Why is it important? Because these kinds of representations of the city, they matter to policymakers, they matter to people visiting the city. Most importantly, they matter to the people who live in the city, to residents of the city who can then organise around different ways to advocate for different kinds of agendas in the city. So counter mapping and cities within the city, those two concepts are connected. And we argue in the article that they contribute to a theorization of counter cities. And that was our contribution to the special issue. And counter mapping attunes us, if we go through the city and with the purpose, with the intent of counter mapping, it attunes us to the idea of cities within the city. So instead of thinking, here I am in Surabaya, it can change our mindset to here I am in lots of cities within Surabaya, which occur simultaneously. And lastly, countermaps offer opportunities to connect with diverse forms of urban activism. So there's lots of other things that are going on in Surabaya, which maybe are going on in little pockets. People, I don't know your city obviously as well as you do, but the times I've visited, you know, there's lots of things that are going on. There's lots of initiatives to make sure that food can be grown in Surabaya, to make sure that kampungs have community economies that support themselves, to make sure that waste is dealt with in sustainable ways, to make sure that public transport is available, so to make sure that the river is going to be cleaner than it is. So there's all these kind of like disparate initiatives, and those can be connected through counter mapping processes, although it takes quite a lot of time and resources. So before I finish up, hopefully that made the article a little bit clearer. And what I wanted to do is just zoom out a little bit from that article and from Surabaya, and just talk about how this kind of approach is used in other ways. So I'll just talk very briefly about some of my other projects which use these kinds of theoretical concepts, but also which use the same methods. Because once you start using the methods, then you get quite good at them, and then it's not that hard to just kind of apply them in different ways. So this is a project called Water Stories, which the website, if you want to have a look, is waterstories.info. And what we were doing in this project is, people probably have an idea of Sydney as being the harbour city. It's got this beautiful harbour. But what you might not know, or you might not think of Sydney, is that it's actually largely built on swamps, like Surabaya. It's got huge areas of mangroves like Surabaya. It's got complex river systems and complex wetlands, which are all behind the harbour, right? And it's not sort of the main postcard vision of what Sydney is. So in this project called Water Stories, we were sort of reframing what Sydney was by asking what the city was built on in relation to water, and trying to get people to connect to caring for those water systems. So this website goes through a lot of histories of water, and this particular one is a image from when there was dredging along a main canal of Sydney, and when they were dredging the canal, they found a dugong skeleton. Do people know what a dugong is?
Yeah.
It's like a mammal, a big mammal.
Mhm.
So
Mermaid.
very big mammal.
Mermaid.
Mermaid. Yes. So they found a skeleton here, but it wasn't just like a skeleton of a mermaid, of a dugong. It was a dugong that had been butchered and eaten by Aboriginal people. And the history before that was that it wasn't well understood that people had lived there in that area. So it sort of changed the whole way that waterway was understood, and not many people know that story. Anyway, there's lots of interesting stories about Sydney's waterways in this, and it's counter mapping because it offers a different map to what the conventional map of Sydney water is. We also, with that project, we made an atlas which documented those stories, and it includes a whole lot of interviews with knowledge holders of the stories of water. Another project with using similar methods was to map our campus. And I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney. So the University of Technology is all about technology. They love to say that it's all about engineering and high-end facilities and advanced manufacturing and fabrication. That's all true. And the campus is also part of ecological systems. So our idea in this project was to map those ecological systems which the campus is on, which nobody thinks about and is in fact often ignored and displaced by the idea of technology. And so we made this map of campus called the Planty Map and the Planty Atlas, which really showed the ecologies rather than the technologies. They're the only examples I'll show you. Just to finish up with a few questions which might open up our discussion. And I guess I'm just really interested in whether this idea of cities within the city resonates for you. If you've observed cities within the city of Surabaya or perhaps other cities where you might be from or you might have visited. Also, if you've had an experience with counter maps, if you've ever used one or thought of a map as a counter map, or maybe some of you have made a counter map, which would be extra interesting if you want to talk about that. Yeah, and maybe this is more about what you would like to do than what you have also experienced. There are further questions which we can come back to if the discussion doesn't get going. But thank you so much, Terima kasih. If you're on Instagram, you can follow us and our research at these two places. And I'd of course love to hear from you and about what kind of counter mapping work you're doing in Surabaya as you're learning. I think the time is okay, Mas.
Okay, it's past for 40 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I think that is great new knowledge for us, how we see the Surabaya from different perspective. Okay, so in these sessions, I give 20 minutes for discussing. Maybe here the participant, maybe you want to ask about the topics that are the presenting for us today. Oke, atau silahkan bagi teman-teman yang
Oh, I
mau
think
menanggapi.
someone raised.
Oh, Bimo. Oke, silahkan. Bim, saya berikan kesempatan untuk Bimo dulu. Silahkan.
Okay, thank you for the explanation, but I've read your article in English one and the Indonesian one, but I still can't understand what is the contour mapping itself, because in my head, contour mapping is you contouring the map that has been exists right now, right? Like maps that created by the government or created by Google or something like that. But I see no maps there in in your article, and that's really make me confused there. And then what's the basis what the basis for making this contour mapping, Surabaya contour mapping that you write down in the article? Maybe I have the second question here. Can I, Mr. Falk?
Yes.
Okay. The second question is the one that apa ya, make me interested is in the conclusion that you mentioned that contour mapping offers slow. What do you mean by offer slow? Because Surabaya is one of the biggest city in Indonesia, and where people are always moving fast, must be efficient, and everything is fast paced. And yeah, maybe that's my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, they're very, very good questions. So the first question, what were we mapping? The main analysis of this article is of the Pertigaan maps. And I don't know if you saw the images of those, but it's a process that Anita and Celsia went through to map the different quarters of Surabaya, but from different historical perspectives. And also the research for them was developed through walking tours. So this is where the article started by looking at those designed artifacts and what they did in the world to kind of draw people into a different way of seeing Surabaya. And so to go to your example of, yes, look, conventional maps or government maps or Google Maps, like now when we talk about a map or an urban map. That's pretty much what people mean is Google Maps. So that's what first comes to mind, and it will show you how to navigate from one place to another in the most efficient way. But a counter map will show, maybe let some of that data go and maybe focuses on some other data. So for example, the research around transport in Surabaya is really interesting, because if you come to Surabaya, I mean, I don't know how many of you have come to Surabaya to study from elsewhere. I'm not sure, but I certainly have the experience of visiting Surabaya, and it is, when you come to a city like Surabaya, like Jakarta, but they're also very different cities. It's immediately a city for cars, right? The roads, it is overwhelmingly for driving cars, and that is the first impression. But as soon as you take some time, slow down, to go to your second question, and give up on the agenda of getting from one place to another as quickly as possible, there's a whole lot of other things going on. Okay, so there's things like kampungs where people have to turn their motorbike off when they go in the kampung because there's children running around, or it's pedestrian focused. I know there's fewer of those than there used to be, but that is a very significant thing. That is a community demand about the pace of that space. So it's a reclaiming of a space for a slower movement. Now, what the thing about counter mapping is that there isn't a map of that stuff, right? The only thing that there's a map of is the road. So what is the road? The road is where we can drive our car. So even in Surabaya, when you use Google Maps and you put that you want to walk, the path will often be on the road. True? So these, counter mapping as ways to walk is a really good example, but also modes of public transport, or ways to navigate the city that aren't specifically for that pace of work, it's a city of work. For example, what does a map of Surabaya look like for a child? If we emphasize a child navigating the city who doesn't go to work, it's a very different map. So a counter map could be a map for a child, a counter map could be a map for an elderly person, a counter map could be a map for noticing things that weren't human beings, for birds, for plants, so it's really about pulling focus and emphasizing different things. Does that make sense?
So counter mapping is focusing on one thing that not mentioned in the regular maps, something like that, or
yeah, but not just for the sake of it. Like, not just so that you can make a map that looks different.
yes, yeah, okay.
Because there's politics to this. So if we go back to the example of counter mapping in Kalimantan that Nancy Peluso uses, what was happening there was that there was documentation of the forests and the old growth forest and what forests were being felled. And then the Indigenous people were saying that is not what we're seeing on the ground. So they used counter mapping to map from their perspective a different data set. And sometimes those data sets are in conflict, but sometimes those data sets exist simultaneously. And what I mean by that is, in a city, we can have a set of roads for efficient navigation with cars, and we can also have cities within that city where people might becak, take a bemo, or like walk, or someone is in a wheelchair. Those things happen at the same time. But the counter mapping that I guess that we're interested in this article and that this framing is about is really about political agendas in the city. So why would you do those? Not just to have a pretty map, so that you can show something to advocate with.
Okay. Thank you very much for the explanation.
Sudah terjawab, Imo?
Sudah, Pak. Terima kasih.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So we have two participant again, here Nurkansyah Sailendra. Before I give Destika, I give Nurkansyah first.
Okay, thank you, Miss. Are you hearing me, my voice? Are you hearing my voice?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the attention. Maybe I will to ask about how can counter mapping methodologies shape contemporary urban planning and policymaking in post-colonial cities like Surabaya or Jakarta or another cities like this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. I have a big question about that because it links a little bit to the previous question. So if we say that counter mapping counters something, it means that it's sort of like against or on the side of or in relation to a kind of mainstream map, right? So sometimes probably in urban planning speak or community engagement speak, we might say that there's like a top-down map of the city and that there's a bottom-up map of the city. How do those speak to each other? Now, the issue with that is that there's lots of methods for consulting community, for example, or for participatory planning. Lots of ways, and certainly a lot of planners and a lot of government. But Lily spoke earlier before we began about the service design event that she'd been to, which is all, you know, the bringing design methods into governance and urban planning is all about bringing participation and more voices. In principle, that's really good. But if you're going to do that, then perhaps it's no longer counter mapping. So if you're bringing that into the process, you no longer have like a map and then a counter map, which tells a different story. I think that both are necessary. I think we need to shift regular urban planning and historical urban planning processes, which, let's face it, come from colonial histories, both in Indonesia and in Australia. We need to shift those. We need to break them open. We need to do things differently. And I think we also need to make sure that we're keeping alive critiques of what is happening, counter voices, activist voices, different ways of seeing the city that maybe shine a spotlight on alternatives as well. So I think both of those things need to happen at the same time. But I think your question about like how do you use counter mapping as a method in say urban planning that's actually going to make a difference, that is a really good question for everybody. And I think it's probably not, there's not an answer. It's just a dynamic back and forth. There's just a dynamic of progressive ways of doing things that are inclusive and that critique, and then kind of the more conservative ways of doing things changing and opening up. That's in my opinion. But let's see how your election goes that you just What do you think?
Okay, I think I understand, and thank you for the explanation, Miss. Thank you.
I'm also not an urban planner, so I want to say that I'm sort of saying this speculatively without really understanding fully the processes of urban planning. I have lots of colleagues who are urban planners and I will work with them, but that's not my area of expertise. So I just want to say that also. But it's a great question.
Okay, thank you, Miss.
Okay, thank you, Ali, for the answer. So we move to Destika Pramesti. Okay, time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Falak. Hi, Ali. My name is Deas. Thank you for the explanation. That's new insight for me. I just want to ask you something. According to what you've learned, in Indonesia, especially in Surabaya, there are lots of cities with the city, like you said, there are lots of kampung-kampung and gang-gang in Surabaya. But does these things also happen in Australia or in another countries? Because I'm never going to another countries. I just stay in Indonesia.
What a great question. What a great question. They happen I think in every city, but in different formats. So in Sydney, we don't have kampung. It's not a it's not a word people use, but we do have neighborhoods. But really the cities in Australia, because they're much newer, younger than cities in Indonesia, because Australia only began to urbanize much later than Indonesia. The cities are built at a different scale. So they have suburbs. And so we have inner city suburbs, which are smaller, from times of industrialization and workers' cottages and things like that. And then as you move out to the city, you kind of have waves of where the urban growth has happened. And there's big suburbs with big lots of land. Some of the way that the cities are designed in Australia is very, very inappropriate. For example, it's big blocks of land that don't have enough people living on them, that aren't energy efficient, that are getting very hot because they're very concreted. So there's a lot, I think, that Australian urban planners could learn from Indonesia in terms of density and how communities can live together, you know, sharing resources and living with a lighter touch, using less energy, using less infrastructure. So those are kind of in Australia and Indonesia, the things that are being dealt with. That said, all cities have kind of small streets and walking pathways and kind of alternative ways of getting around. One of the debates in Sydney, and my city, is very ongoing, is around cycling. So people love to cycle in Australian cities, but it's not safe because the cities have been designed for cars. So there's always this dynamic about cycle paths and alternative routes for cycles. And that is a very, very live debate, which, like some of the things we've been talking about today, goes back to the history of what was prioritized when the city was built. So yeah, I mean, what I'm looking at the moment in Sydney is waterways and wetlands, and lots of those have been buried, but they've also shaped the way that the suburbs have been built in Sydney, and people don't quite understand them. I hope one day you have a chance to visit cities outside Indonesia, because I feel like because of your question, you'll be very curious and you'll have a very good eye for observing what's different and what's the same. Yeah. But I think that there's always a dynamic between the equivalent of kampung and gang, but in different cities. Yeah.
Okay, is it enough, Des?
Totally. Thank you, Ali and Pak Falak.
Okay.
You're
Okay, thank
welcome.
you. So in the next questions, we have Raymond Pileo Saragi. Silakan.
Okay, previously, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, in the essay, there is a section part that say designing with this practice in mind can provide evidence to the strengthen political agenda, such as improve the level of social housing or public transportation. Because it's election season here, so many political cadres are taking to the streets and seeking for people vote. My question is, this mapping have a big influence on politics and should be used by politicians? I think that is my question. Thank you.
Well, I haven't studied the impact on politics, so it would need someone to pay attention to it. My intuition would be that the maps that we're talking about as counter maps in the article don't have a big influence on politicians. But I guess my point would be that what would and should have an influence on the political agenda is different ways of looking at the city, different ways of understanding the city, and different bringing different voices into discussion about the city. Now, how do we get there? There's lots of different ways to do that, but I would argue just having like a rally on the street with one person shouting and everybody else following isn't necessarily the way to include all those voices. So look, there's lots of examples of how we could do things better, but often what we see in, for example, the area I work in, and which is really to do with urban renewal, what we see is developers having a vision of the city which they're imposing on everyone else. So this part of the city is going to be really great, and here's an architectural drawing of it with like everybody sitting under trees and sipping iced tea or whatever, and isn't it lovely? The truth is, whenever you renew a part of the city, other people are displaced, not only people, but environments and histories. So part of the argument is, let's just stop and ask some questions before we move at this past. Like, of course, housing is really important, but not just housing for wealthy who can afford a brand new house at the cost of wiping away what was there before. You know this process very well in Surabaya. I know you do. And it happens also in Sydney. So I guess my argument is a little bit of a roundabout way of saying it, but my argument would be for keeping those discussions alive in really concrete and diverse ways. So there's lots of ways to do that. One is by providing visual evidence. If we don't have maps of what the city is like, then you know what? People in power are just going to pretend that it never was like that, because it's not to their advantage. So part of it is about documenting the voices and the people that matter at the moment. It's a tricky question though. What do you think? Do you think anything like this could have an impact on political agendas?
I think, yeah, absolutely in here.
Oh, that's good.
Oke, Raymond, sudah Mas Raymond cukup atau ada yang masih mau ditanyakan?
Ya, saya rasa sudah itu aja, Pak.
Oke, terima kasih. So, because in this year we face a local election in the end of the year, so some of the students try to relating what we discussed today with the next agenda. The nearest agenda, we will hold local election, right? So, okay, thank you for Mas Raymond. So, ada Mas Rafli Rizky Akbar, silakan.
All right. Firstly, can you hear my voice? Okay. Here's my question. It's about sustainability, about counter mapping efforts. How can counter mapping projects like Pertigaan Map and Surabaya Ngalor Ngidul maintaining their relevance in a rapidly changing urban context? That's it. Thank you so much.
In terms of sustainability, specifically?
Yeah, just in terms of sustainability.
And what do you mean by sustainability?
Mungkin bisa lebih dispesifikkan, Mas Rafli. Bentuk
Yes,
sustainability-nya kayak apa gitu.
In rapidly changing urban context.
Yeah, I
Just
think
like that.
the
That's
reason
my question.
I think it's a very good question. The reason I'm asking about what you mean by sustainability is because it is a very broad concept and people use it in lots of different ways. So let's talk about the environment. and what can be sustained in terms of the natural environment in a city like Surabaya with climate change. Is that kind of getting maybe a little bit close to the question? So in climate change, it's actually, it's pretty scary. It's going to get a lot hotter, of course, but also the water's going to rise. So in cities like Surabaya and Sydney, both of us are port cities, we've got serious issues about water and how we manage water in the city, correct? So we've got rising sea levels, and then we've got increased dramatic weather events like more rain and a stormwater infrastructure that's not fit for purpose. So we've got a lot of things at once. So what can something like counter mapping do in a rapidly changing urban context because of climate change? Well, let's just go back to thinking about documenting how people get around the city as a basic thing. So like when people get around the city when it's flooding is quite different to how people get around the city when it's dry. Correct? But if we don't document that or visualize it, all we've got to go on is Google Maps, which doesn't tell us that information. So it doesn't tell us, for example, what was once a swamp, what was once a wetland and it's going to be a wetland again. It doesn't tell us where we should and shouldn't build because the river's going to overflow. It doesn't tell us which parts of infrastructure are vulnerable. What we can do through counter mapping is we can look at archival maps and then we can look at what exists now and we can have more details about, for example, ecosystems in the city or weather events. So I think this is an area where this kind of work is really, really, really vital, actually. And I think that lots of the data to visualize cities at the moment that's used in planning, and particularly that's used in kind of sustainability discourse, is missing people. It's often mapping like the topology of the city or the built environment, but often it doesn't have social practices. It doesn't have how people interact. It doesn't have how a market operates. It doesn't have how a kampung exists. So these kinds of things, unless we pay attention to them and we document them and we talk to people, they're just invisible. So I think it's very important to do this kind of work in a time of climate change and rapidly changing urban contexts. I hope that sort of answered your question. I think this is true of all cities, not just Surabaya. All cities.
Oke, Mas Raffi, cukup? Atau ada masih mau ditanggapi?
Yes, I think that's enough. Thank you, Miss Alexandra.
Okay, I think we have good discussion between our speaker today with all of the students. So as the close questions, I just want to ask, I read the article in Indonesian version. So I catch the important point from the counter mapping. One point is how we, let's say, combating or fight against the colonial heritage through the spatial planning. So my questions, sometimes, in my opinion, the creations, let's say, from the Dutch or the colonial government is much better than today's planning. So why the city should fight against the colonial mapping if when we can apa ya, mendapatkan manfaat gitu, give advantage from it. Maybe you can give us yes, that's my question.
I think this is a really good question, and it goes back to one of the other questions, which is one of the problems with this idea of counter. So like if you have a counter map or a counter culture or a counter story, it's like it's the opposite. But there's a little bit of a limitation to thinking that way. I don't think that's exactly or a counter narrative. I don't think that's exactly how we need to be thinking about it. When I think about counter mapping, I'm thinking more that what we need is a series of maps and stories and narratives that are kind of give a counterpoint rather than an opposite. Do you know what I mean? So they're not necessarily against. So to go back to your question around colonial infrastructure for the city, or I completely agree. And this is where I like Tim Cresswell's idea of when you read a colonial map, for example, an archive, you might read with the grain and against the grain. So this is like a piece of timber. You know, a piece of timber has a grain and it goes one direction. And if you read it one way, you're reading it with the timber, but if you read it across, it has quite a different feel, and it feels like you're kind of going against it, but it's also a very worthwhile way to understand it. So I think we need to do both those things. I'm not talking about like, you know, throw out everything that's colonial, certainly not. And, you know, you look at a city like Surabaya, there's so much, I mean, that's ridiculous and impossible. All of the water infrastructure, which is the part that I'm interested in, is there to stay. So it's about building on that in ways that actually take into account more diverse needs and wants and visions for the future. I mean, what we don't want is the kind of dynamic that was part of colonial politics between those in power and those that weren't. And I think this is why the questions everyone has been asking around elections are really important, because whose voices are heard and whose are not. That's the question, not is that colonial or is it post-colonial? I think, you know, the ship's kind of sailed on that in a way. But this is why I think it's very important to differentiate between decolonization in different places. Because in Australia, just to go back to Australia and my city, you know, so much knowledge is just pushed aside by the kind of logic of, let's say, colonial or let's say capitalist development. And what I'm talking about is things like how the ecology of Australia works, how the water systems work, how the seasons work. You know, in Australia, where I live in Sydney, we talk about European seasons: summer, spring, winter, spring, summer, autumn. We literally talk about the year in that way. We don't have those seasons in Australia. We have very, very different seasons. So it's just an example of, if we don't understand what this place is about and all the knowledge is imported and put on top of the ecosystem, it's not going to work. What I'm talking about there is, again, to do with water and seasons and climate change. It doesn't work here the way that Western knowledge and European knowledge is imposed. So every place is different, but I think I don't mean we should throw out everything that is colonial, for sure. What do you think? What do you think, Mas Fala?
Yeah, I think in my perspective and in the Indonesian context, sometimes the colonial heritage, it's always we still can use it until now after 100 years from for example, like bendungan, the pintu air, and then
Yeah.
the water system, irrigations, or anything. So road, there is a lot of heritage that we can still use until today. So yeah, that is if I see from the positive perspective about the colonializations, they create the, let's say, the better infrastructures than present. That
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, I agree, but I'll just challenge you on one thing about that. So if you look at, say, the Pintu Air or the railroads in Java as another example, and people will use these as an example of colonial infrastructure and say, well, the colonizers made things better or whatever. And I get it, but who built those things? Javanese workers. So who do they actually belong to? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, get it.
So I agree with the heritage aspect, but I don't agree with the I guess the split between a history belonging to one side or another. Do you know what I mean? This is where I think it's really interesting to think about all those trajectories that exist in a place. But infrastructure is so fascinating, and who's maintained it and who's kept it working and who has replaced the broken parts, all of that. Like, the Dutch were long gone.
Yes, so we should see from the other perspective, not only see the quality of infrastructures.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you. I think that is a great sessions. So we it's more than 1 hour, right? Like from our schedule. So I think it's really good for us can discussing something, and big thanks to all of the students who participate on this event. So I give back to Lily.
All
Thank
right.
you, Ms. Ali, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Falak, for moderating today's session. Thank you so much, Ali, for delivering a very, very insightful knowledge to us, even though, again, it's something new. I noticed that we're quite struggling in understanding this concept, this counter mapping concept, but I think we're going there. We're getting there. As long as the more discussion that we have, I think we're getting familiar with this topic, with this issue. I think one of the keywords that you have that I think personally was so powerful is that when you said that maps always has a power structure, right? And there is no such thing as a neutral map. That's why we need this counter mapping. But it is understandable that maybe for some of our students, this unequal power relations, the imbalance of the power relations itself, it's not, they do not really yet understand that. So I think I understand that it's quite hard for them to grasp this concept, but hopefully, the more discussion that we have, it's going to ease them to understand the concept. But yeah, thank you so much again, Mas Falak and Ali. Let's end this session with photo group.
Oh, yay.
Yay! How to do this? Wait, remove spotlight. Remove spotlight. Okay. So everyone, if you want to be in the picture of the group, you can open your camera, and then I'm going to capture each of the screen. Okay, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, and then at the count of 3, I'm going to take a screen capture of my screen. Okay. Open your camera. Okay. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, I see some people are still opening their camera, so we're going to give them some time for them to do that.
Some people are in the dark, I think.
Yeah. In the dark, because it's night already here. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Once again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Once again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Okay, I think that's all. Again, thank you so much, Ali, for being so willing to share your thoughts and your insight from your article to us. It is such an honor for us to have you here together with us. And then thank you so much also for all of my students. Even though it's very hard to grasp for you, it is very hard for you to understand this concept, but thank you for staying until the end of this session. See you at the next guest lecture session. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Good luck.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Thank you, Miss. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.